Det er kanskje litt sånn at skulle vi lage musikk av Neil Mercers budskap, så hadde vi kanskje blitt akkurat det vi hørte nå. Nå er det keynote nummer 2. Neil Mercer sammen med alle dere andre, så å si. Nå er vi kjempespente på hva resultatet er av deres kunnskap og hans samling av den. Så velkommen tilbake, Neil Mercer. Welcome up. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Can you put the PowerPoint up? Well, that's a hard act to follow, though, isn't it? Yeah. What can I do? It's only words, and words are all I have to take your heart away. Here's the questions from the groups. I've condensed them. Obviously, there were about twice as many, but we did some interthinking in the room over there with my group, and we managed to get them down to about 14 or 15 questions, which I hope include the essence of most of what you all said. So if you find your question isn't there, you can always boo at the end or something. And we'll go through them and see what you think. The first one then, the challenges of a multicultural classroom. I was wondering how to answer this. What I would say is, having worked with teachers in some very multicultural classrooms, some very multilingual classrooms, for example in Bradford in England, I would say that they're probably, strangely enough, some of the easiest ones to get the teachers and children to understand the importance of language, because there's more than one language there. So language is surprisingly quite visible, if you like, apparent to everybody in the classroom, in a way that it isn't necessarily in a mainstream classroom. The teachers themselves are usually very aware of the language diversity of their children nowadays. And some of the challenges are obviously to get the children to actively participate. And that's another reason why group work can be very important. What they've done in Bradford, they've set up a scheme called Talk Partners. And what they try and do, for example, one of the strategies is when some new children arrive who are only just learning English, they try and find another child in the class who speaks the same home language as them, but is more fluent in English, and they make them their talk partner. So then their job is to ensure that that child gets heard. And so in the group they will say they will have to discuss something, a science experiment, and the child's partner will say, wait, we have to hear what Ahmed thinks about this. And if Ahmed can't say it in English, he can say it in Urdu to his partner, who can then explain. And in that way, Ahmed gets more confident at explaining his ideas, and the children get to hear his views, and he hears more what they're saying in English. For children under 12, learning a second language is nothing. It's automatic almost. And so they just need the opportunity. And so I think it's using strategies like that that can make the multicultural or multilingual environment quite good for developing oracy. What is oracy training for teachers? Well, I think what oracy training for teachers begins with, as with students, becoming aware of how as teachers they use this tool of language. Because spoken language is sort of invisible. It gets taken for granted. Writing is so obvious and an object that it tends not to be seen in that way. And many initial teacher training courses still don't really feel, certainly in the UK, and not all of them anyway, know that they've got to train people in using talk to become good teachers. So I think one of the ways is to get teachers, is for teachers themselves to observe themselves, to video themselves, or watch each other is another good way. But to just think and just ask themselves questions like, well, okay, if I just record the first 10 minutes of my lesson, how many open questions did I ask? You know, just what did I do? How did I involve the children? And by raising their awareness, they then become more reflective about what they do. And I think, as I'll say in relation to perhaps one of the later ones as well. One of the best ways that we know now that teachers learn to develop their own practice is through working together. It's through interthinking. And we've had a big project with Camden, a part of a borough in London, using the approach called lesson study, which many of you will know about, I guess, from Japan. One of the people who runs the Camden Education did a PhD on lesson study at Cambridge. And the idea is that the teachers are each other's critics, friendly critics and observers, and they work together to improve their practice. So I think that's one of the best ways they can do so, rather than being told by people like me, necessarily. The third one about researchers dealing with, I mentioned about false dichotomies, like between progressive and traditional teaching, between instructional teaching and facilitating, between group work and whole class teaching. All false, completely false. Teaching skills rather than content. Not a choice. You can do all of those things. You can do all of them together. I think any useful dichotomies probably come from teachers themselves, who say, I'm finding it hard to reconcile the demands of this, of that, of teaching children how to use spoken language and teaching science, or in making sure group work have enough time and yet covering enough topics in the lesson. I think the best dichotomies for a researcher to work with are those that the teachers themselves generate. Within the approach to language, to understanding spoken language called conversation analysis, some of you may know about, they always say that what you should really be dealing with are the participants' questions about a situation, not the researchers' questions about the situation. What do the teachers feel are the issues about dialogic teaching that they see as throwing up dichotomies or dilemmas? And I think that's one way I would answer that question. How can a teacher best implement a dialogic approach in the classroom, and what resources are available? Well, I think one of the best ways is really to think about what ways you can use a variety of forms of talk in teaching any topic. I mean, how does the topic lend itself to whole class discussion of initial ideas, to students working in groups to try and come up with questions themselves, or students working in groups to try and solve some problems and then report back? It's a case of thinking, how can I use the different kinds of talk, and how can I use them for this particular subject? So I think it's always a case of thinking, what is it you want to teach on any one occasion, and how will this, over a series of, say, 3 lessons, lend itself to different forms of dialogue? And I think the other thing to say is that with initial teacher training and with the students as they first begin, is for them not to expect it'll work straight away. If students have been used to teachers who only talk to them, who only ask closed questions that want one right answer, and aren't used to working in groups, they're not going to just change because you are there and you're just going to start asking them to answer in a different way. They'll think, wait a minute, what's wrong here? Something's funny. You know, I should be careful. I mean, if you compare Robin Alexander, who I've worked with before, his book Culture and Pedagogy, which I don't know if you've read, but it's a very good book, where he compares education in France, England, the USA, and one other place, Russia, that's right. And he there does look at some of the differences between the way students expect to work in classrooms and what we would call how the ground rules of classroom participation differ. The notion of ground rules, and it relates to a later question, is a really useful one, I think, for understanding talk in social situations. Ground rules, I don't know what it is in Norwegian, it's reglas básicas in Spanish. It comes from sport. It's the notion of not the official rules of football, but those that, or of any game, but those that people know apply in a particular stadium or in a particular kind of climate or whatever. They're the unwritten rules that yet everybody knows and are vital to make it work. And they are vital. I mean, look, this is apparently seems to be working quite well as a conference, okay, at this session. Why? because I'm just standing here doing the talking and you're all sitting listening. That's because we think that's what should happen now. The ground rules. As you were coming in, you weren't handed a set of ground rules that said, when you come into this conference, while the speaker's speaking, you should sit quietly looking at the speaker, not speak to your neighbor, only look at your mobile phone very secretly. And if you want to ask a question, wait till the end and put your hand up. So you shouldn't, for example, stand up and start giving another talk over there now. It might be better, but it would be breaking the ground rules. But we all knew them, and we took them for granted. So students do the same. What Robin Alexander found was in Russian classrooms, when a maths class, the teacher would say, okay, who's had a problem dealing with this last set of maths questions? Anybody? And the child at the back would say, me, I couldn't understand it at all. And the teacher would say, okay, so Ivan couldn't understand number 3. Can somebody come to the front and show him how you do number 3? And he said that was an interesting thing to observe, because in Russia they do very well in maths. It's one of the places they do. He said in England, if you looked in the same classroom, the teacher said, okay, anybody having any problem with any of those questions? They all go, no, keep your head down. Yeah. No? Nobody. No. And then if they did ask them, they said, did you understand it? Well, not really. Can anybody else explain it to Peter? Keep your head down. No. Yeah. Completely different set of ground rules for that situation, where you're not meant to share your misunderstandings. So one of the ways a teacher can implement a dialogic approach is by revisiting and revising those ground rules with the children, because they'll have to learn that different ground rules are now going to apply. You're going to take longer turns, it's okay. If you don't understand, you can say so. I will sometimes say as a teacher, I don't understand, and they won't go, these are the different ground rules. So that's one of the most crucial things a teacher can do. It's easier for primary teachers because they typically have the same class all the time. For secondary teachers, where students are moving in and out of different teachers' classrooms with different ground rules, it's a lot harder. But that's how to do it. One of the ways. And there are resources available. There are many on, if you look at Robin Alexander's own work on his website at York, you can find some. And if you look at our Thinking Together website at Cambridge, if you Google Thinking Together Cambridge, you'll find lots of resources there for teachers, not just for researchers. What have we learned from the neuroscientific study that's useful for the development of oracy and reasoning skills? Nothing. Right. Okay, next question. No, that's not quite true. What we've learned is that language is, as Vygotsky thought, more integrated with the development of cognition and reasoning than we thought. One of my colleagues, Usha Goswami, who's a very prominent neuroscientist at Cambridge, she's found, for example, that some parts of the brain that are to do with understanding rhythm in music are associated also with processing speech. So some kinds of dyslexia, language or other kinds of language processing problems that some children have, those same children find it very hard to see the rhythm of a song or a tune. And so it's not as though language is only, like I said, just a set of finite functions in one part of the brain. There are lots of other parts of the brain involved in processing language than those in Broca's area, or that bit that we used to think as the language kind of area. So we know that, and that's useful to know. But what I meant was, neuroscience hasn't told us, and so you should do this. They're not at that point. What they're doing is finding neural explanations for things that we sort of knew. And that's as far as it's gone, really. What role does oracy education have in vocational training? Well, that's one of the things that we're exploring a lot in the Oracy Centre. That's exactly what we're doing. We're not just working with schools. In the conference we had when we opened it earlier this year, we had people from social care training, we had lawyers, we had people who were teaching executives how to give talks, people teaching counsellors how to become counsellors and listen to people and so on, teaching other people who were helping resolve industrial disputes in various industries. And all those people who are concerned with developing professional skills are all concerned with oracy. But in the past, they've all been working completely separately. You've had teachers, you've had industrial trainers, you've had counseling trainers, and so on. And there's nothing really in common. And what we found, it's very helpful to have got together and find out what we find works and what makes good communication in these different settings and how they found it helps to develop it. One of the most powerful talks that was given at that conference was from this guy called Nick Andrews from Swansea University, who works in social care training. And he told us how in the training the people who care for old people in care homes in the UK, there would be no attention at all to giving them conversational skills, to dealing with, with their clients or the people they're caring for in the care homes. None of that was given. And in fact, he reported that when they were asked about this, they'd been told in their training that they should not get into personal conversations with the people they're caring for. And one woman said she was even told off because she started to tell some of the people she was caring for about her children and what was happening with her children. And her manager said, you shouldn't be sharing personal information with them. It's not professional. And he said, this is crazy. This is crazy. So they developed a whole scheme there where they had old people. I'm an old person, I suppose, but people who were actually being cared for coming into this group as well and saying what they would like to happen. Because some of those people had, they were former teachers or managers or whatever, doctors and things. And they were saying, well, what would you prefer? And they were saying, we'd like to have real conversations. It would make it more like a real home if we could have conversations. And so they're training these people now to converse effectively. So there are lots of areas of life where this is important, not just in school. But if it starts in school, then you're not starting from zero when you get to some professional training as a young adult. Nursery education. Somebody mentioned that in a few of the questions. Again, obviously, I mentioned earlier that children's early life experiences of language can have a massive formative effect on their educational progress. So it's vital, for some children especially, that those in nursery education realize that they're the second chance, as our teachers, for giving these children a richer environment in which to use language. It's been shown in research that, for example, skills in remembering, memory skills, are massively improved in young children if mothers or fathers, parents, carers, have what are called elaborated conversations with children. And this means that when they're out doing things, the contrast is between the child saying, oh, look, mother, there's some ducks on the pond. And the mother says, yeah, that's right. And he says, what are the ducks doing, Mum? Well, swimming around, I suppose. We'd better go home now. Yeah. And that's not so uncommon, I've heard this. While the other mother would say, look, Mum, there's some ducks on the pond. Oh, yes, there are. Can you tell which are daddy ducks and mummy ducks? How many baby ducks there? What do you think the ducks do when the pond freezes? And things like that. That's an elaborative conversation. And what they find is if you ask the child later what happened in that day, a day or two later, they'll remember it in detail. While the child who had the first conversation probably won't even remember that they saw any ducks. And that seems to develop their remembering skills. So those children are then better at remembering something new that the experimenters gave to them than the other children. So obviously nursery educators, nursery carers are vital in helping that for some children. Are other modalities important for learning as well as language? Well, yeah, they are. People often say, haven't you done anything on non-verbal communication in classrooms? I say, I'm only one person, I only have one life. I can't do it all. Other people can do that. That doesn't mean I don't think it's important, but I don't think we can cover everything. The scientists who just study the moon, they don't have to study the sun as well. What I think, the only risk I would say is, although I think these other modalities are important, and there's a whole line of research being carried out on multimodalities in education at the University of London, at Institute of Education, I think the only risk is I wouldn't want people to think that they're all as important. I think language has a special place in those media or modalities. I think it has a very special place in human intelligence and the development of cognition. So I don't think they're all equal. The other ones are important, but I think language deserves special attention. And I think you probably all know that there are this approach which some teachers have taken up, learning styles, where say, oh, somebody's a tactile learner or an auditory learner or whatever. Rubbish. Right. No real evidence for it. Okay. Just a way of making money. That's right. So why focus on oracy rather than metacognition? I hope I'm not insulting anybody who asked this. False dichotomy. It's not oracy rather than metacognition. It's oracy and metacognition. Through developing oracy, you develop metacognition. You become more metacognitive. You become more metacognitive by using language to talk about your thoughts, to become more aware of what other people are thinking, and therefore on what you're thinking yourself. Through becoming more aware of what others think, theory of mind as it's called, you can become more reflective about your own thinking. And in fact, as Svein was asking me earlier about self-regulation, this notion that children who do better at school are better at self-regulation, it's true. But all the evidence from the work by my colleague David Whitebread at Cambridge shows that the way children develop self-regulation is through co-regulation. They learn how to regulate themselves by, first of all, as Vygotsky put it, doing so in the social plane and then bringing that to the psychological plane. So if they can learn to regulate their activity in a group through understanding the ground rules and through carrying out interthinking together, they come better at regulating their own learning activity and become more metacognitive. So the two aren't separate. They're bound up. That's what human intelligence is. Makes them inseparable. This is an interesting one, and we talked about this quite a bit in the back room there. There are so many imperatives for teachers about learning and so many objectives and so many targets that it's almost impossible, isn't it, for them to say, oh God, here's another one. I've got to do that as well. It's true, and there should be fewer. But what we try and say to teachers, and what the ones who do it say themselves, is it's not a case of having to do oracy training as well as subject-based learning, so much as you do it as part of it, and that by helping the children develop their spoken language skills, you're actually helping them learn better in the subject. So it's not like a contest, though it is another dimension to consider. One way that we've found works very well is for the teacher to set two kinds of, in Britain they have these, they either call them learning goals or learning intentions, and teachers are meant to set these out in their lesson plans, especially when they're first teaching. And so they say, well, today I'm going to teach about magnetism, right, okay, and about which metals are magnetic. That's my science topic. But you can set next to that, as a teacher, a spoken language goal as well. You can say, we're all going to learn about magnets today, but we're all going to learn about asking good questions. So what I want you to note is, in your groups, when you're talking about magnets, make a note if anybody asked a really good question. And then the next lesson, you can talk about, it'd be something else about forces. You could say, today we're going to see whether everybody made a contribution in the group. And we'll come back to that. And at the end, the teacher can say, well, what did you learn about magnets? Let's look at that. And how did you get on with your questions? So by setting two goals, you actually keep both things visible in the child's mind as well as the teacher's. And that seems to work quite well and not be an overload kind of situation. How is oracy development related to improvements in creativity, problem solving and reasoning? Well, this, as I say, I've got a whole talk about this. And I've got a couple of articles which are in the references at the end of this PowerPoint, my other PowerPoint, if you get it. It's because, essentially, this is the distinctive nature of human intelligence, that we have a social brain. it's not that we've just got more intelligence than other species, bigger brain. It's that the kind of intelligence we've got is essentially and intrinsically social. We are creative collectively. We typically do not solve problems, important ones, as individuals. We solve them in collectives, in groups. It's not always an easy process, but it works. And other animals can't do it. They just can't. And one of the main reasons they can't is because they've not got language. And so what children do as they're growing up is they observe and hear and participate, even in a limited way, in hearing other people making sense of the world through language. And through doing that, they then learn, pick up those ways. As Bakhtin said, you don't learn words from dictionaries, you take them from other people's mouths. And what they do is they then use those as a tool themselves to make sense of the world. And so by learning effective ways of using language and using it to think collectively, we can harness our individual brains into a mega brain. And that's much better for solving problems than an individual all on their own. But only if we know how to do it, because we're not programmed perfectly just to do that like the bees are with their language. We have to learn and be taught. But if we do, this means that we can become more creative collectively and become better at problem solving. And by learning to solve problems with others, as we've shown in our research, children take away that ability to solve problems better on their own. So that's why these things are bound together. It's just the way we are. And it's taken us a long time to realize that. There's been a myth of this kind of geniuses who solve the world's problems and get a Nobel Prize, you know. Or they can write songs and get a Nobel Prize. But in fact, it's rarely, if ever, an individual who does so. It's nearly always a collective of people. And some people get the credit more than others. But that's how it works. The next one, how can teachers select appropriate subject content to encourage exploratory talk? Well, we discussed this one quite a bit as well. One way is to think of topics within your subject area that allow themselves to more than one interpretation. For example, it's easier in some subjects than others. You can actually offer 2 points of view, say on what happened in history at a certain period in history. There was this opinion. The Civil War in England was very good because it created Parliament and we've benefited ever since. Or the Civil War in England was one of the worst things that happened because it created so much bloodshed and religion never recovered properly from it. And you can say, okay, for advanced students, they can talk about things like that. So that's one way, is to look for things that genuinely allow for some debate. The other way, in, for example, science subjects, is to pick ones in which you can get the children to reveal their own everyday conceptions of what happens. Like, is this bottle exerting any force on the table? Is the table exerting any force on the bottle? If you ask students or even adults that, you'll get a variety of answers. And yet there's one scientific explanation. And what it's been found is if you can get students, they did this at Oxford University, which also sometimes does some things that are quite good. Sometimes. What they found was, if you get students to first of all think about what they think they know about a question like that, or a topic, and then you tell them, then you give them the lecture about forces, they remember and learn much better from that lecture than if students who just went and heard the lecture. So if you can get them to first of all articulate their own ideas and then see how they relate to what they're going to hear, you get much more effective learning. So that's another good way. Getting them to think what they already think they know kind of makes them more receptive to new ideas. And that applies in any subject, though it's particularly easy to sort of see in science. Number 12, the single thing that a teacher can do, if they only were going to do one thing to improve communication amongst students in groups, is get them to consider what ground rules they're using and get them to change those ground rules. they're always using some ground rules. Every situation has ground rules, as I said, and yet they won't be necessarily aware of it. They could be working in groups using ground rules like, if I know the answer, I won't say anything, so I'll get the best mark and they won't. Or they could be following a ground rule like, well, whatever Anna says, I'll agree with her because she's my friend, even if I don't really. Or, I don't know much about this subject, so I'm not going to say anything. Or, I think I know more than everybody here, so I'll just talk all the time. Those are rules that children and adults, I've been in meetings, staff meetings at Cambridge when people are using rules like that. If they're using those rules, it's not interthinking. It's not going to work. They're not going to be creative and collaborative and construct new knowledge together. They're going to be going wrong. In the book that I wrote with Karen Littleton called Interthinking, we looked at lots of other areas of life as well as education. And one of them was research that's been done on government decision-making in America and in the UK. And for example, it seems like one of the reasons that we went to war in Iraq, the UK, when we all think now, everybody thinks it's a bad idea, was that people in the Tony Blair cabinet and decision-making groups at the top of that government at the time, they were following rules like, well, I'm only a junior researcher, so whatever I think, I'll agree with Tony. Or if the Conservatives say this is what they think, they're the other side, so I'll always dismiss it. Or I'll always go along with the most people in the room who are saying yes. They seem to follow rules like that, rather than we should all critically consider what the possibilities are, and even if I'm a junior researcher, I should offer and be listened to for what I might say that can contribute to our joint understanding. And even if I am Tony Blair, that doesn't mean I've got all the right answers. I should be ready to listen to anybody's point of view, because it might be really important. Those are the other ground rules. So certainly, the most effective thing you can do is get the students to say, what makes a good discussion? Tell me what makes a bad discussion. And then from that, you can construct a set of ground rules which will generate exploratory talk. They're not that hard to do. And if you're on our Thinking Together website, we've got some resource for teachers to do that, to help them set a series of 3 lessons in which they gradually set up these ground rules and get the students to start to use exploratory talk. It's not hard. That's the single best thing to do. Is dialogic teaching good for all students? Yeah, it is. Because sometimes the students who are least keen, often, we've found, and other people have found, on being involved in group work in class and in whole class discussions are high-achieving girls. And I know this because I've got a daughter. And she said, I don't really know why they're always asking us to talk in groups, because, well, you know, I think I understand it all already, and I don't really see why it's doing me any good. And I don't really see why they always put me with these other kids and stuff like that. And I said, that's terrible. That's awful. You know, don't you think that you can get something from it? She said, well, I'm not sure. Anyway, she did get involved in the groups, and like other children who we've had in our studies, she said afterwards, wow, it was actually really useful. Because for a start, I found that I didn't understand everything I thought I understood. And what's more, some of them understood it better than me. And what's more, I found that when I had to try and explain what I did understand to someone who didn't understand it, I got much clearer in my own head about what I understood. And so I'm now much more confident about what I do understand. And as a teacher, you would know that you often don't really know whether you understand something until you've had to teach it. And then suddenly realize, oh, I'm not quite sure. So everybody can benefit. The children who will learn from their peers because they don't understand, and the ones who think they do. And the whole thing is in fact, I think, if you ask them in advance, as I say, some of them will say they don't want to do it. But afterwards, they nearly all find that they've had some benefit from it. So I think it is good for everyone. And is oracy education necessary for all? Well, it is, because as I put up that whole list of skills in the Cambridge framework, some people are good at some aspects of oracy and some are not others. There are some people who are great at doing a talk in front of a class or in front of a group, but put them in a group and they just don't listen. They're no good at that. Well, there are other people who are really good at handling a group and making sure everybody contributes and kind of checking the group's done everything. But put them in front of the group, the whole conference then to explain, they're really stuck. And there are lots of varieties of ways in which people differ. So you can't assume that somebody who's good at talking in one situation is good in a different way. So I think oracy education is something that would be very dangerous to assume that only certain people need it. I think it's a case of finding out what the skills that people have developed, children have developed, and which ones they still need to develop. And what is the relationship between talk and writing development? This is a complicated one. I was glad this one was last because I don't think I can say a lot about it really. It's a very complicated relationship. There are people who do learn to write very well and they're not necessarily the most fluent speakers. We'll all know people like that. However, certainly speaking, we found in our own research that if you're involved in argumentation of a positive, exploratory kind in groups, we've found that the students, this is with secondary students, the students' own written arguments, when they had to write the essay with the arguments they construct in answer to a question, got better. So again, it was that through debating and discussing with other people in talk, you're more able then to construct on your own a reasoned argument, because that's what an educated person is. You sort of have, an educated person can sort of have an argument in their own head, can't they? On the one hand this, on the other hand that. But have I thought of everything? What if somebody said that? So I think the relationship is quite complex and demands a lot of attention. But I think it's a positive one if it's handled in that way. And it's seen that you can gain skills in creating written and understanding of written language through discussion. It feeds into it in a positive way. Okay, I think that's a lot. Whew. I hope I haven't gone on too long, have I? No. So I think, what's meant to happen now? I just stopped, don't I? Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. Right.